Ladies and gentlemen,
Welcome to another episode of Shadow Fiend! Agent Smith. World Discussion. Today is January the 23rd, 2022, and we live in strange times.
I'm about to jump in a chat with Mr. Agent Smith to figure out what the heck is going on with the world. Where is he? Hello? Oh, I have push to talk on. Hello? 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 Hello?
Hello?
Oh, he's here. Hello?
How you doing?
Well, it's a weird time to ask that question.
Is it?
It's not a weird time for you to ask the question, but I've had a shitty week. How are you?
Well, I'm doing okay. I'm sorry you've had a shitty week.
It's okay.
I think you mentioned you've been sick.
Yes.
Oh, what did you have?
I don't know, but it was something that got the full-on fever going when you're in bed for multiple days, riding it out, that kind of a deal.
Gotcha.
It hit me right after I returned from my trip, so I probably got it when I was out.
It wasn't COVID.
Well, I don't know. I wasn't going to go out when I had a fever to see what it was. I could have, but it seemed unwise to me.
Gotcha. Well, did you ever lose your sense of taste?
No.
Okay. Well, I recall that was one of the symptoms, so maybe you just got something else.
Yeah, it could be. I survived it, though. I just have congestion and stuff now, but was able to stream yesterday and today.
Gotcha. Well, so long as you're okay, that's the important thing.
Yeah. So it's been a couple weeks because I did the trip and then I was sick, so I didn't do Agent Smith that time. But a lot of stuff has been going on. Whenever I was like, I might have Agent Smith today, they're like, Ukraine updates. So that's the big ticket item, which maybe it's not as big as people think it is, but I have seen like lots of different articles, and it reminds me of Battleship because they're saying the UK sent this boat here with this stuff on it. Canada sent this boat here with this stuff on it. And I think Russia rolled through the English Channel with a whole bunch of boats, and there's a certain rule about what they can pass through there and how they're meant to pass through there in terms of their formation. But I don't know all the details about that, but it seems like stuff is happening over there.
Well, I mean, it's still difficult to say just how much is posturing and how much is substantive, but yeah, there's been quite a bit of maneuvering. Yeah, I think what you were referring to as far as the English Channel was the Russian Baltic Fleet was dispatched. And we don't really know where they're going, but it seems clear that they're either going to the Black Sea or the Russian government is trying to signal in order to intimidate the West, in order to kind of indicate that they're bolstering forces there. So it could go either way. It may be that the Russian government itself doesn't even really know just what they're going to do. So still kind of up in the air as of now. Yeah, negotiations are ongoing. I mean, obviously, the US has been very invested in trying to maintain negotiations. One of the things I read is that one of the US strategies here is to just try to keep the negotiations going as long as possible. Because have you ever heard of Rasputitsa?
No.
That's probably not how it's pronounced. That's my best effort. But basically, that's like the rainy season in Western Russia. And I think it happens in like, I want to say October, October, and then also again in like March or so. If we have anybody from the region who can correct that for me, uh, please do. Here's there's a good signal for the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here, if not most of it. So if I ever say anything that's wrong, stupid, or biased, please do let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So feedback is definitely encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will, read it later. But that said, one of the things I read that the United States might be trying to do is just to try to extend the negotiations for as long as possible in order to try to get to March, basically, to the rainy season, because it's thought that it's less likely the Russians would launch an invasion at that time, just because the roads and the general landscape will be much less favorable to maneuver operations. So part of this on the United States part is probably just delaying tactics, just trying to drag talks out as much as possible. But that's not really a strategy per se. That's more just playing for time. I mean, eventually the rainy season ends, right? So
Yeah,
what do you do then?
it reminded me of a filibuster.
Yeah, kind of similar.
Just keep talking, and hopefully they'll forget to take their military turn.
Yeah, that's that's one way of looking at it. But I don't think the Russians are going to forget if that's what they want to do.
So
We just
a question that I have about the whole situation would be, what would Russia try to grab if they're going to try to grab something, and what do they stand to lose? Because most people I've been reading have been saying that the U.S. would hit them with sanctions, but it's unlikely that we would just like declare war on them or something if they did grab for more territory. But sanctions are obviously going to have an economic impact on them. I think maybe we already have some sanctions on Russia, so like how would it change for them if they took territory?
Gotcha. So I'll answer the second part of the question first. As far as sanctions, what's in place right now are sanctions targeting mostly individuals, but also some of the larger business interests that have close ties to the government. So if there were new sanctions applied, they would be much more substantive and broad-based. So for example, what's been talked about is SWIFT banking sanctions, which would basically cut out the Russian government and pretty much all Russian economic actors from the international banking system, which would, of course, make it much more difficult to raise capital, to borrow money from financial interests. But it would also make it very difficult just to do business. Because if pretty much whenever these days you pay for something, you're probably using like a debit card or some such, or a business account at a bank. So invariably, you end up having to make some kind of transfer between your account and the seller or buyer who you're dealing with. And if you can't use the financial system, then you can't do that, and you have to come up with some kind of alternative. Now, contrary to popular belief, SWIFT banking sanctions do not inherently prohibit any and all economic activity from happening. It just means you have to find an alternative to the SWIFT banking clearance system specifically. And there have been alternatives created already. China, Russia, and other parties have tried to do that. The trouble, though, is that SWIFT banking sanctions invariably come with other sanctions that penalize any economic entities that engage in trade with the target country. So Iran knows all about this. They've pretty much been the case study as far as extensive sanctions regimes. So, even if you find a partner who wants to trade with you, and this is what happened with Iran. Iran and Europe wanted to continue to trade with each other after the United States left the nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions. And so Europe actually created an alternative, basically an alternative to the SWIFT banking system in order to clear transactions between economic actors in Iran and Europe. But what they found is that very few European firms were willing to take advantage of that because the United States implemented, as part of its sanctions regime, a rule that would apply sanctions to any firm that traded with Iran. So even though there's an alternative to SWIFT available, you may find that there's very few takers because a lot of firms do a lot of business with the United States, and given the choice between access to the US market and, say, the Iranian market, or in this case, the Russian market, most of them will probably prefer the US, and so will refrain from trading with the targeted country. So that's what Russia and Russian business is looking at in terms of an escalation of the sanctions regime. It would be a pretty significant escalation, and it would do some damage as far as interest rates and prospects for growth. That said, the Russian government kind of knows and has known that's a possibility, and so ever since the whole, Crimea imbroglio back in 2014, they've been trying to prepare for the prospect of having swift banking sanctions applied to them. So there is some resilience built into the Russian economy to a degree. For example, I don't know that the Russians did this specifically to prepare for swift banking sanctions, but one of the things they did in retaliation for Western sanctions was to apply sanctions of their own against the West that basically barred exports of many agricultural goods to the West. And, Europe does a lot of business with Russia as far as like grain and stuff. And so, adding that extra cost to those exports, if not banning them completely, was meant to put pressure on European countries that were thought to be susceptible to that kind of pressure. It didn't end up working, but as far as I know, those sanctions are still in place. And as a result, Russian agriculture has had the benefit of, well, in addition to the export restrictions, also import restrictions. So Russian agriculture has had the benefit of having a protectionist regime in place, which has, had the downside of increasing prices for consumers, but obviously that's a big benefit for agricultural producers in Russia. So they've been able to make some money and invest in production and whatnot. So Russia is relatively more self-sufficient in production of agriculture than it was before, as far as I know. So basically just little things like that, just the slow separation and decoupling of the Russian economy from the European economy has happened over a long enough period of time now that it wouldn't necessarily be all that disruptive if there were a clean break in trade, as would, for the most part, happen if swift banking sanctions were applied.
And
So it
then,
would do damage, but they would probably be relatively resilient to it. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, it would do damage, and it would do damage in a place that they would have anticipated.
Yeah, exactly. So the damage would be more like long-term damage rather than short-term damage. Let's put it like that.
Yeah, and then they would need to have some benefit to taking the territory as well. Like some the reason they would feel like it was worth it to do that with the sanction that they know that they'll get hit with.
Yeah, so that's the first part of the question. So as far as that, I've been listening to some podcasts and reading about it, and one of the ideas that came up is that they probably, if they do invade, they're probably not going to invade in order to conquer territory or annex it or break apart Ukraine or what have you, or even to outright just conquer the whole thing. From what I was reading, it's more likely that it'll be a limited war, like what Russia fought against Georgia back in 2008. And in that case, the objective was basically just to force concessions and to put Russia in a maximally advantageous negotiating position in order to extract those concessions. So in that sense, it may be that they just invade a little bit, so to speak. They just push into eastern Ukraine, maybe 100 miles or so, defeating the Ukrainian army and doing so, and applying pressure to the Ukrainian government in order to give concessions, in order to avoid further damage or further Russian gains. Another thing I've read is that this one analyst was arguing that given the disposition of Russian forces in southern Belarus and in southwestern Russia, he suggested that it was more likely the Russians were planning on a push to Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. So in that case, they could push to the capital and then stop just short and then just threaten to take it if the Ukrainian government doesn't basically give what they want, or they could just take the capital outright and negotiate with either negotiate with the government in exile or possibly install a more friendly ruler there in Kiev. There was some talk about that in the past couple days. I think it was, I don't remember if it was Biden or the British government, but there was a statement from the Western government to the effect that the Russian government was considering installing favorable leadership in Ukraine. But the idea there is that they would install the favorable leadership and then probably just leave, having gotten what they wanted, assuming, of course, that the political situation is sufficiently stable that they would be able to stay on. Obviously, the whole Euromaidan experience kind of calls that into doubt. But the idea here, again, is a limited war. They're not necessarily invading to stay. They would be invading to extract the desired concessions and then withdraw to their starting position. I don't think they would want to annex the Donbass, that is to say, the two separatist republics in the far east of Ukraine. Because, as I've heard argued, it's actually much more useful for Russia to have those separatist republics in Ukraine and to have their representatives in the Ukrainian government voting in a way that sways Ukrainian policy in a way that's favorable to Russian interests. So in that sense, they would actually prefer those republics to stay in. And actually, one of the reasons I've read that the Russian government is so antagonistic and agitated about this whole Ukraine issue is because the Ukrainian government has somewhat dragged its feet on granting the two separatist republics special status in the context of the Ukrainian constitution, and has also dragged its feet in sort of reincorporating them and their representatives into Ukrainian government. So I don't think annexation is in the cards, basically. It looks more likely that this is going to be a sort of diplomacy by force, if you will.
It doesn't sound like diplomacy to me. It sounds like militarism, but...
Well, it's Russian diplomacy. They like to do things tough. It's sort of always been their way, whether they've substantively issued threats or whether they've bluffed. They've always come across pretty strong. Mm-hmm. From what I've heard from, a journalist, I read an article years ago from an experienced journalist, and he said that in his experience, the best negotiators in the world were Russians and Americans. So the Russians always go hard when it comes to negotiations. So it's no surprise that they're bringing the heat here, whether they mean to invade or not. So those are roughly the stakes we're looking at right here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because to give an example for how heavy sanctions are, we have sanctions on North Korea that are much heavier than the sanctions on Russia currently.
Oh, yeah.
But if this keeps escalating, then it would be closer to similar sanction levels.
Well, I don't know if they would go full North Korea. North Korea is basically all but, shut off from the international economy, other than what they get through smuggling anyway. So they'll probably slam them with pretty significant sanctions, but there will probably be room for further sanctions, I imagine, just so that they have somewhere else to go. If they just sanction them in every way possible, then that kind of closes off an avenue of further negotiation. So a sliding scale is more likely to me than a nuke.
If we sanction them all the way, then we can't sanction them again the next time they do something bad.
Well, that's the idea. You want to have something to discourage them with. Otherwise, all you have is the prospect of lifting sanctions. Mm-hmm. And you may or may not want to do that, depending on their behavior. But it may also be that the Russian government doesn't really care at this point. It's not... one of the things I've noted listening to analysts is that a lot of them are kind of confused as to what the Russian government is going for here. Because a lot of things that they want, they could probably, for the most part, get without doing any of this. It just seems like there's a lot of unnecessary drama. As far as joining NATO, that's kind of controversial within the context of Ukrainian politics, or at least it was. And they had enough sort of proxies within Ukrainian politics to probably block that going forward. And so if that's what they wanted, they probably could have had that without doing all this. And it seems like, threatening Ukraine like this only makes it more likely that they would want to join NATO, and creates more unnecessary tension as far as the West supporting the Ukraine in its effort to join NATO. So it's not entirely clear just what they hope to gain by that. I think in general, Russian foreign policy has kind of been a mystery under Putin for a long time. I mean, to be fair to him, as well as to his predecessors in the Yeltsin government, there was an honest, genuine desire to kind of integrate more with the West, over the course of the 90s and the early aughts in particular. But progress was pretty slow, in so much as there was even progress at all. Europe was very reluctant to kind of fully embrace Russia. The country was just so big that the prospect of, just fully liberalizing trade and opening up borders was always a little bit intimidating, especially given the unrest and instability in Russia in the 90s. So I think there was a lot of disappointment as far as the pace of integration, to the point where a lot of people, especially Russian nationalists in the Russian government, were skeptical the West was really genuine about wanting to integrate Russia into the West. And so I think that kind of undermined a lot of otherwise sympathetic liberals in the Russian government, if not Russian society writ large. And of course, there's the now famous issue of NATO expansion. Well, I guess it's always been famous, but in particular now. So that, of course, always aggravated Russian nationalists to the point where they genuinely suspected that the West didn't trust them and was up to something. In fairness to the West in the 1990s, I don't think that they really thought it would be that big a deal in the long run, because I think they figured that since Russia was kind of on track to integrate with the West sooner or later in some capacity, maybe not joining NATO per se, but maybe creating some new security architecture for Europe, that would kind of ease any potential problems that would come with NATO expansion. But obviously, that was a bit that was a bit hopeful, if not naive, in retrospect. But I suspect, that the Russian government, probably not Russian society, but I think the Russian government kind of knows that NATO isn't all that much of a threat to them. Because I know that their espionage is top notch. They lost a lot of things after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but their espionage was not really one of the things that they lost. That was always pretty high quality, especially with all the hacking, going on. So I suspect they know what NATO and the United States and Europe is planning as far as Russia policy. And given that my understanding is that NATO is not planning much of anything and has been kind of an organization in search of a mission since the end of the Cold War, that Moscow kind of knows that there's not really a whole lot to worry about. I grant that they could worry about something that might happen in the future. Obviously there's a lot of political unrest and instability in the West right now, to varying, certainly a lot more than there was. So there's always the possibility that a hostile government comes to power in the West in the future, and that NATO becomes this sort of aggressive expansionist institution that the Russians have always feared that it was. So there's some point to be had there, I grant. But for now, there's no immediate, short to medium term threat. And I have to imagine that they would know that. So, my only guess here is that the Russian government is being opportunist. And the reason I say that is because that kind of fits a pattern of behavior over the past 10 years. They've mostly been aggressive only in cases where they have believed and had good reason to believe that there would be little to no pushback from the West. So, in Syria, they had a country that was nominally their ally, not like a full treaty ally per se, but, had good, strong ties. And they really didn't help out the Assad government until after it was clear that the Obama administration had no substantive desire to actually intervene in any real way. And, that was, of course, after the Obama administration's famously well, not fluked, but flubbed red line as far as the use of chemical weapons. So it was only really after that that the Russians kind of stepped in there. And in, in the case of 2008 with the war in Georgia, I think the Russians pretty well knew, especially given the circumstances of the war, where the Georgians very ambitiously invaded a separatist republic that had Russian peacekeepers in it, hoping that either the Russians would be too cowed or that the West would support them if the Russians did anything substantively. I think the Russians knew that they would be able to do that without substantive consequence. So I think those are kind of useful case studies here, because I don't think the Russian government would be nearly so aggressive in its rhetoric right now, if not also in a potential invasion that they could launch, if they knew that the West, or if they believed that the West would really intervene on the part of Ukraine. Because like you said, The United States isn't going to go to war over this, and the Biden administration has already said itself that the U.S. will not commit any ground troops as far as defending Ukraine. Thus far it's largely limited itself to sending ammunition, weapons, whatnot. Even sending weapons is an escalation because before, I mean, it was almost all non-lethal aid, as it was called. Now they're actually sending anti-tank weapons and whatnot. That's been the new thing the past week.
Those are defensive in nature, though, more so than
Anti-tank weapons?
Yeah,
Defensive.
yeah, that's what I mean.
Oh, sorry. I thought I heard offensive.
No, I think that was the idea, was that Canada and the UK were bringing them equipment, which is like, it's military equipment, but it's not stuff that the Ukraine could then use to just start marching on Russia or something.
Yeah, exactly.
It's mainly to protect Russians from rolling through with tanks.
Yeah, and actually, having brought that up, that kind of also underlines my point about the West not really having ill intentions as far as Russia. When the British sent their shipment of anti-tank weapons to Ukraine, they had to fly them around Germany, which a lot of people kind of noted somewhat conspicuously as an example of a lack of European unity on the subject. Germany in particular has this weird thing, this weird pathology about Russia. And they insist that they uniquely understand the Russian soul and have a connection with the Russian people and nation. And since the 1970s, there's been an insistence on what did they call it? I think they called it something like Ostpolitik. Basically, they just wanted to try to take a gentle approach in their foreign policy towards Russia, in the hope that mutual understanding could lead to de-escalation and tensions. But they've been pretty consistent about trying to do that almost regardless of context, to the point where I don't know that it's all that useful at this point. But regardless, there's little interest on the part of the German government to really go hard on Russia. And I think that's kind of one of the big stumbling blocks that the West has right now as far as trying to approach the problem with a common front. Obviously the United States can put a lot of pressure on Russia vis-a-vis sanctions and whatnot, but really the United States doesn't do a whole lot of trade with Russia itself. Most of the trade Russia does, it does with China and Europe. So if Europe isn't on board, that's going to significantly undermine any sanctions regime. As difficult as SWIFT banking sanctions may be to get around, invariably there will be smuggling and whatnot that people can get around if the Europeans don't really play ball and enforce a substantive sanctions regime of their own. And Germany, of course, is the economic engine of Europe. So if they're not on board, that really kind of brings into question whether or not there's going to be sufficient economic deterrence to sway the Russian government's calculus here. Yeah, the Biden administration got in a lot of trouble over this. I think it was last week, maybe. The Biden, well, not the Biden, but Joe Biden himself was making a statement on Ukraine, and he kind of accidentally let slip that there was a lack of unity amongst the United States and European partners about what to do in the case of a limited war. Apparently they've already agreed that they're going to hit with sanctions if there's a full invasion. But apparently there's no consensus yet on what degree of response to implement in the case of a limited Russian incursion into Ukraine of the sort that I discussed earlier. So that's not the best look, really. You don't really want to imply weakness on the part of your coalition in negotiations like this, especially at a sensitive time where you think an invasion could be imminent. So that was kind of a mistake on the part of the Biden administration. They kind of tried to clean that up afterwards by making it clear that even a limited incursion would incur significant sanctions. But the cat is kind of out of the bag. Like, it's clear that there are substantive disagreements there that a clever Russian government, clever Russian diplomat rather, would be able to exploit in the right circumstances. And the Russians are nothing if not clever about foreign policy, so I suspect they're already planning to do that. If they weren't, even before the gaffe in question. If I want to be generous to Joe Biden here, I could say that maybe he was trying to bring that disagreement out in the open in order to pressure Europe, in order to kind of put pressure on European leadership to kind of do more in order to reach consensus. But probably, given Joe Biden's history of gaffes of one sort or another, it was probably just a shoe in mouth moment.
Oops. Yeah, that's an interesting aspect of secrecy is it requires an active awareness of what information that you have is meant to be kept secret, and you can't just say it in that room, but you could be in a different room with different people and that's the topic. So
Yeah.
yeah. Whoops. So
To
yeah,
be
it seems
fair,
like we'll see how much of this is Russia wanting to posture to make their own position look stronger overall versus if they actually want to grab something. You
yeah.
said Kiev would be the maybe potential target. Isn't that the capital?
Yeah. But
Ooh.
again, I don't think they would be taking it to keep it. It would be either to extract concessions or maybe if they're feeling really ambitious to install new leadership that is pro-Russian. But I don't think they would stay for very long afterwards. I don't think they're interested in a prolonged occupation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's pretty clear that there's a substantive anti-Russian sentiment at Ukraine at the moment. So there would no doubt be a fair amount of insurgency if they did try to occupy Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, as strong as the Russian army is, I don't think the Russian government is interested in any kind of Afghan-like scenario where they're having to fight off an insurgency for a long period of time. That would be too expensive and it would be enormously politically unpopular in Russia. You know, in general, the Russian public supports the Russian government on the Ukraine issue. But that sentiment could change in the event of a prolonged war. You know, I don't think anybody's interested in that at this point. But to be fair to Joe Biden, again, and the West in general, I don't think that there's anything Joe Biden intimated about a lack of consensus that the Russians didn't already know about. Because again, you know, I'm sure they have infiltrated, you know, I'm sure their intelligence has infiltrated the communications networks in question. So I imagine there's not much there that they don't already know about.
It's fine, guys. They knew that anyway.
Yeah, the Russians have always been really good about that. What was it? There was one guy that Reddit was kind of talking about a couple weeks ago. He was an FBI agent who was tasked with trying to find a mole within the FBI. And it turned out that he was actually the same mole.
Oh.
So pretty slick operations there for the KGB.
Guys, you have a mole in your agency. What? How do you know this? What? Who told you? What information do you have? It's me. I had a sudden attack of conscience. I need to tell you.
Let's see. Well, I guess while we're still on this, I could. You were asking about some of the demands that the Russians were making and that the U.S. were making in the negotiations. And I didn't have all of the details on me at the time, but I did have some more information on that. So some of the things some of the things the U.S. rather is demanding. One of the things they're asking for is the removal of Russian peacekeepers from Moldova and Georgia. Actually, are you busy? You might find this interesting if you're not in game. If you look at a map, you can see Western Ukraine, and to the immediate southwest of Ukraine is Moldova. And roughly the eastern half of Moldova is a separatist republic called the Transdniester Republic. And that's mostly populated by ethnic Russians, as opposed to the rest of Moldova, which is populated by it's a combination of ethnic Romanians and then a small minority of ethnic Turks in the south. And the Russians in the country were not that interested in separating from the Soviet Union back in the day. And so they decided to just sort of declare independence on their own. And Russian peacekeepers, quote unquote, have been protecting that separatist republic ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's been a useful excuse to maintain troops to the west of Ukraine ever since. So it's kind of a strategic thorn in the side, so to speak, the western side in particular of Ukraine, that Kiev and the West are kind of interested in removing. The peacekeepers in Georgia, I think everybody's pretty familiar with, or at least those who were familiar with the war in Georgia. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were three separatist republics that tried to declare independence from Georgia. One of them was conquered by the Georgian army and reintegrated into Georgia. I think that was the one in the southwest. I think it was Ajaria, something like that. But then the other two were Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And Georgia kind of had a love-hate relationship with them afterwards. Russian peacekeepers were deployed in those two republics, and then in 2008, the famous President Saakashvili, again famous if you're Eastern European. I think if you're Eastern European, you know immediately who Mikhail Saakashvili is. He got really ambitious and he decided to just invade South Ossetia in the hope that he could just reconquer and reintegrate it outright. Um, that went very poorly. Russian troops just outside the capital, Tbilisi, was the result, which was obviously not the desired outcome. And there's been Russian peacekeepers ever since. So those are two examples of strategic gains that the West would hope to make as far as concessions from Russia in the current negotiation. I doubt the Russians are going to be willing to give up any of that. But when you enter a negotiation like this, you kind of have something to ask. And that is a substantive, legitimate ask on the part of the West. The US is also asking for the removal of Russian strategic missiles from Kaliningrad, which is something the Russians did very conspicuously a couple years ago. They went out of their way to move missiles there to kind of intimidate the West and to have something to, well, what's the phrase I want? To have a chip to negotiate with, basically, in future talks. And so, mission accomplished. Here it is. The U.S. wants the Russian government to remove them. I was listening, because I'm a nerd. I had the BBC radio on one night, and they were talking to a representative of the Russian government, and he responded pretty strongly, to his interviewer, asking whether Russia would be willing to remove those missiles, and he said very clearly, no. We should be able to deploy missiles anywhere in Russian territory that we want. It's our own sovereign territory. So I suspect there's not going to be much change there either. But again, the point isn't necessarily to bring that ask into the negotiation because you think you're going to get it. It's to basically bring it as leverage. You want to be able to say, hey, this is something we're legitimately concerned about.
You said peacekeepers in Georgia and Moldova?
Yeah.
What's this little piece of land in? It's like just to the south in the east of Moldova. Is that part of Russia?
That's part of Ukraine.
Oh, this is part of Ukraine.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to see because you can see that little river there.
Yeah.
That makes it look like it's a separate territory, but that is actually contiguous part of Ukraine.
Oh. Cool.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to see on that map. Let me see if I'll Google you a Transdniester map.
How did they get into Moldova?
They already had troops there, during the Soviet period, and they just sort of never left.
Are they old now?
Well, I don't know. I don't know that it's the same troops. I mean, I imagine they've rotated them out since then, but who's going to push them out? Like, that would be a pretty bold move, especially for countries that have a border with Russia in the east. So they're just kind of ensconced there at the moment. Yeah, there was somebody on the Ukraine subreddit a couple days ago, I guess, that made a map kind of making fun of Russians for saying that NATO was encircling Russia and showing a map of Ukraine with all the different locations of Russian troops, in the west in the Transdniester, in the north in Belarus, in the south in Crimea, and in the east in Russia.
Mm. What's the kind of reasoning / propaganda of Russia wanting to take stuff and change Ukraine? They believe that there's people who are just Russian and they want things done in the Russian way, so they're saving them or something?
No. I mean, social media and sort of the Russosphere kind of makes that argument sometimes, and Russian nationalists are definitely motivated by that reasoning. But it's not really what Moscow is after. Again, like I said earlier, it's not entirely clear what Moscow is after here. The popular theory seems to be that Putin kind of has a 19th century mindset and that he wants a Russian sphere of influence and that he kind of wants to make a bold move in order to retaliate, so to speak, against what he sees as Western connivance and duplicity in expanding NATO, despite having promised the Soviet Union that they would not do so. So it seems like this is kind of more of a personal thing for Vladimir Putin. Again, that's just a theory, but that seems to be the one a lot of analysts are going with at this point.
Yes, it would be. What's the basis for this strategy here? Why are we pressuring them? This is a big operation. Mainly, it's for his that man over there, his ego. It would make him feel strong. Oh, great.
Yeah, I sent you an article here that a link anyway, and that has a map showing where the Transdniester Republic is. I know we've got some Russians, or maybe had them, who've been listening, and I saw them in chat making the point that, you know, the United States has a de facto sphere of influence in Latin America, and if anybody did anything there, then there would be a huge reaction on the part of the United States, a la the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that's true. I don't disagree with that. I think that's correct, and I don't begrudge Moscow for trying to do the same thing. I understand the reasoning and logic there. But I think the thing that's kind of difficult to understand is why this is the approach they're going with. Like, there are more subtle ways to do this that would be just as successful, if not more so. So I think it's kind of a bold move on the part of the Russian government, just to kind of show that they can. Again, the West has been a little bit feckless in the face of pressure on a number of fronts, over the past 10 years, and this is just another one. And, I think the Russian government wants to kind of sow its wild oats, so to speak. If it's okay for the United States to kind of up and arbitrarily invade, Iraq and Afghanistan, why can't Russia do something similar out of national security interest?
They got to do their adventurism years ago. Why can't we do ours?
Yeah, and there's some logic to that. But they had to have known there was going to be a reaction, however mild it was going to be. So, I mean, I don't think anybody has any business being surprised at how things are playing out. But I think, the West is probably not, unless the West comes out and does something more substantive than just threatening sanctions. I don't know that it's going to necessarily be enough to really sway the Russian government. I've kind of gone back and forth as to just whether or not current deterrence would be enough. And I'm still not entirely sold one way or the other. It kind of seems like something we're just going to have to watch play out. But I kind of feel like it's going to take something more, given how committed Moscow is at this point. Another thing that I read from another analyst is that, this is a lot of buildup on the part of the Russians for them to just end up backing down later. So it seems like they're really committed to doing something or achieving something. I'm sure they would prefer, as much as anybody, a negotiated outcome. But, if the West is not willing to play ball or give the kinds of concessions they want, it really puts them in an awkward position. If they stand down, that's a little bit embarrassing. But if they go hard and do a limited incursion of some kind, then that really commits them as far as getting concessions. And they're going to have to go all the way at that point, pretty much. At that point, I don't know that there's anything the West could really do to deter them. At that point, you either have to jump in with your own forces or you just kind of have to stand back and let it happen.
We do have some viewers from Russia and Ukraine in the chat this evening. If you have any interesting takes, we are curious to hear about them. Someone was saying that the reasoning for all this is that they fear NATO in the West. Ukraine is not in NATO currently, right?
No. Probably never will be. I doubt that NATO would ever really let them join, just because of the outstanding territorial issues. I think if you read international, what's the word? The realist international relations scholars, their perspective on NATO is that it should be smaller, and that the United States is overcommitting to the defense of very small, weak countries that don't really bring a lot to offer to the United States itself. You know, in the opinion of realists, defense treaties and defense organizations like NATO um, should only be made in the case where there's a substantive interest at stake. And realist scholars are at pains to find any kind of substantive interest that the United States has in, say, Montenegro or Macedonia or, you know, some of these other small countries in the Balkans that NATO has been expanding into. So, you know, in those cases, realists don't understand why, you know, what the benefit is. Like, why bother with that, given that it's going to be hard to defend countries like that. They don't bring a lot of benefit to integrating into the West, per se. The United States itself has very little connection to them, you know, economically or politically or even socially. So from their perspective, why bother at all? And it kind of seems like it's just expansion for the sake of expansion. And, you know, in that perspective, it makes a lot of sense for the Russian government to be exasperated by NATO expansion, because it doesn't seem to have any other purpose other than to agitate them and to put Russia at a strategic disadvantage in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Well, it kind of goes back to a conversation that we had many episodes ago at this point about the information campaign in the US of a sort of good versus evil narrative in the world, of an axis of evil. And for that perception, the Soviet Union and or Russia have often and regularly been seen as the villain to the US. Like, they're an antagonistic force, so strength from the US needs to be represented to keep their power in check. And then when the US does moves like that, it spooks Russia, and they feel like they need to raise their power level similarly to protect against any shenanigans there.
Yeah, there is a bit of tit for tat there. But I would point out that since the end of the Cold War, there hasn't really been a lot of substantive threats going on. And, you know, even in Russia itself, through the 90s and early aughts, there was a lot of pro-Western sentiment, especially in the government. So that didn't really change until, you know, 2005, 2006 or so, when the Russian government started to kind of change direction a little bit. There was kind of a, 5-year transition, let's say, you know, from roughly 2005 to 2011, when the Russian government kind of started to drift away from the West. They started to get more frustrated with the unilateralism of the United States and some of the foot dragging on the part of Europe as far as integrating Russia. And I think around, you know, especially after the unrest after the 2011 election, I think it was, maybe the Russians in check can correct me, but there was an election around 2011, I want to say, and that was kind of one of the first times there was like widespread fraud sufficient to kind of get people out on the streets. It wasn't a whole lot of people per se, but I remember reading about, you know, some protests. And then after that, I think the Russian government was a little bit shaken. And that kind of led indirectly to the 2014 drama, where the Russian government was kind of facing economic decline. Partly had to do with, you know, collapsing oil prices and energy prices in general, but also just ailing legitimacy on the part of the government. And so a little bit of adventurism kind of propped up the legitimacy of the government temporarily. And of course, since then, approval has kind of tailed off a little bit. So now they're kind of looking for something else. So to a degree, you could say that this is another effort on the part of the government to kind of boost popularity by appealing to Russian nationalism. Kind of like Argentina with the Falklands War. We were talking about that a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, your ratings are really, really low. What do? Let's just attack somewhere, and we're gonna pitch it like we're the good guys and we're saving them.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that could also be part of the calculus as well. There is kind of there's a short-term shift here in terms of there's a short-term strategy in terms of popularity that's factoring in, but I think more important is the long-term trend away from the West and towards a more sort of autarkic, self-sufficient vision for Russia vis-a-vis the West. You know, they kind of want to be on their own and more self-dependent, such that they're not as vulnerable to what they see as sort of the randomness and, you know, shifting tides of Western politics, which are very much in flux right now. I can't say I entirely blame them for being concerned about that. But, you know, like you were saying, Neuro, Russia has kind of been vilified for a long time in the West, and the United States in particular. And so there is kind of a sense that they're up to something, even when they're not. So that's definitely colored opinion here. I remember when Mitt Romney was running for president back in 2012, people kind of made fun of him to a degree for coming out and saying that Russia was a strategic rival of the United States, because at that time, the argument for that was pretty weak. But there was some support for that, and that does illustrate sort of that residual Cold War mindset that especially the older folks in the United States tend to have. But to be fair, I would also point out that, Russians are not immune to this either. Obviously the Soviet government went out of its way to paint the West and NATO in as negative a set of terms as possible. So there's been no small amount of fear mongering there either. And it's not as though Russian media is any less vitriolic than Western media, in many ways. So there is a certain amount of bias against the West that is not entirely deserved either within the Russian media and Russian politics. So it's a two-way street in that sense. That's not to say that the Russians don't have legitimate grievances here. The West, well, the United States government did promise not to expand NATO east. So there is some legitimate reasons for upset there. The counter argument from the United States has been that that promise was made to Soviet leadership, which of course ceased to exist after December 1991. So that's a little bit of diplomatic shuffle there. Whether or not that's legitimate argumentation very much is in the eye of the beholder. Obviously, the Russians don't think so. Westerners within government tend to be more sympathetic to that, but there's also plenty of Westerners who are more sympathetic to the Russian perspective. I'm still trying to find a map for you. I think this will have to do. Oh, did you see the Transdniester?
I did. Showed that region on stream.
Yeah, it's just a really thin sliver of territory there. And these are the two separatist republics in Georgia. I just posted that in your Discord thing here.
Cool.
But yeah, lots of excitement going on in Ukraine right now. Yeah, I try to do respect on here to the Russian perspective. I think the last time we talked about it, I talked mostly from the American perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully I've better captured the Russian perspective on that this time. And if not, let me know and I can try better. That's the intention anyway.
Yep,
The point here is mutual understanding and comprehension rather than just trying to paint one side. So I try to be fair in that respect.
We are two Americans speaking from the United States, so no one can be perfectly neutral. Every news source has a bias, including a little discussion with Agent Smith. So be aware of that bias.
Did you see that another country exploded?
Physically or metaphorically exploded?
Actually, physically in this case.
Oh, like one of those big downtown kaboom situations?
It wasn't downtown. This time it was an underwater volcano.
Oh.
Did you see that in the news at all? Or were you too sick?
I did not see it.
Oh boy, Neuro. You're in for a treat. This definitely made the rounds on Reddit. Yeah, it was a big kaboom. I took I've got another set of social media links to this for you.
Chat saying
Here we
Tonga.
go. Yeah, Tonga. It's in the South Pacific. And the volcano in question was not really especially close to the most populated islands, but it was close enough to sever the island's link to the internet. And it also covered the islands in ash, such that planes could not land in the airport. So it actually took several days for anybody to know like how they were doing and what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see, I'll send this to you in Discord as well. There you go. So those are all pictures and things, videos of some of the tsunamis, and also you could hear the explosion like thousands of miles away from the volcano. That's just how big an explosion it was. And satellites in space also captured it. The satellite footage kind of made it look bigger than it actually was. A lot of what the a lot of what the satellites were capturing was actually just sort of the ash cloud expanding outwards.
Hmm.
But just the sheer size of it illustrates how powerful an explosion it was. Let me see here. Yeah, it was pretty massive. I think the ash cloud that you can see from space was almost as large as France. Yeah, another interesting thing I read about that is that some scientists were saying they didn't really fully understand how an explosion like that could cause a tsunami. Apparently, that's not the normal way that a tsunami is created. So there was some curiosity about that.
It's like, can I see link? Are you sure? I have a lot of links. You could hear it in New Zealand, says Vosh, who's a viewer from New Zealand.
Yeah, I think I heard that, or heard people mention that. Yeah, I think I also read that people in Alaska heard it.
People in Alaska?
Yeah, and there wasn't anything major, but some of the tsunami reached California and Peru. From the video I saw, it kind of just looked like choppy water, but they were saying that it was partly from the volcano's explosion.
It's pretty close to New Zealand, so I could understand him hearing it there. Man, Alaska is so far away.
Yeah, when you see the satellite footage, that'll kind of change your mind. It actually makes a lot of sense when you see that.
Yeah. So how much does this affect Tonga? Apparently it's pretty bad for them.
Um, it's not entirely clear. I mean, we don't even really know how bad the tsunami was at this point,
Mm-hmm.
but it has done some damage. I think maybe a dozen dead is what I read, but that was like super early report.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's only been in like the past few days or so that they were even able to land any planes there. So it's pretty early going. But they definitely felt it. Yeah, one of the cool things I read about the relief effort for Tonga is that they actually sent a desalinization ship, which I did not know was a thing. I guess it kind of makes sense, especially for the Pacific Ocean, because you have so many countries there that are island countries and they have kind of limited water supplies.
Uh-huh.
But I thought it was pretty cool that they just had an entire ship that had just was solely dedicated to the production of fresh water. That's pretty neat.
Yeah, it's a fairly recent technology, I think, for us to hone, and I believe it's very expensive to do. But it's something that is
Yeah.
done in Israel more than a lot of other places.
Yeah, Israel does a lot of it. I think Arab countries, well, oil-rich Arab countries, specifically in the Gulf, do a lot of it as well.
Mm-hmm.
They've kind of got the money for it, so why not? Yeah, I think desalinization plants are going to become more common, just because the global population is increasing and, weather being erratic as it's become, it kind of makes sense to have desal plants as a hedge, so to speak. The problem with them is that they're super, as you said, they're super electricity intensive. They require a lot of power. And, that's going to be a problem if they're powering it with dirty sources of energy. So there's probably going to be some push to try to match any construction of desal plants with corresponding increases in green energy. Yeah, the ship in question had something like what was it? It was something like 100,000 gallons of fresh water on board, just stored. And then the desalinization plant was capable of producing something like 70,000 gallons of fresh water a day.
It's a lot.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive. I mean, that should be enough, I imagine, to cover the population's needs. It's not like there's a whole lot of people that live in Tonga. Relatively small island. But yeah, pretty neat technology. It kind of makes me wonder how many ships like that there are, and whether they're kind of kept around just for emergencies or if they have like some kind of regular turnover, business-wise that they engage in.
I would assume that they would be a emergency thing, because if you're investing a ship anywhere, that's a lot of investment in its portability, like the ability for it to travel, which means you're going to cut into the efficiency of it just doing what it's meant to do. Like if you have a set facility that's on the edge of the water, and that's a desalination plant, that seems way more efficient than a boat that's traveling.
That's true. But in the case of the Pacific, there's not really much other way to do that. Land is kind of at a premium, so it would be relatively harder to build a desal plant over there, I imagine. So
True.
a seaborne vessel would make more sense in that sense. And also, given that you're dealing with relatively small populations, you wouldn't need a very large desal plant. You know, obviously it's small enough to fit inside a ship. Normally when I see desal plants, they're pretty large. You would need like a tanker in order to carry something that big. So I suspect this is kind of a scaled down model of that. So it could be hypothetically viable economically to run a business like that. But again, you're probably right. It probably is just like an emergency thing for contingencies. Yeah, you'd be surprised though. There's actually a full-on nuclear power plant way up off the coast of northeastern Russia in the Arctic that is actually built on a barge, and it provides electricity for that whole region up there. Yeah, apparently that was just more efficacious than building it on permafrost, which I've been reading recently is like very difficult to build things on because it's kind of unpredictable. Well, it's not that it's unpredictable, it's that it's predictable in how much it changes. Like it melts obviously once a year, and then that kind of undermines the whole foundation of whatever you build on it, and then it freezes over again. And also it tends to move around a lot apparently. It's just very difficult ground to kind of work with construction wise, as I understand it. So building something on a barge kind of makes sense, as an alternative if possible.
At least this water stays water.
But yeah, that was a pretty big deal while you were sick. Let's see. What else did we have here? Is there anything else that kind of caught your eye in particular that you wanted to get to?
Well, there were French lawmakers who officially classified the Uyghur situation to be genocide, but a bunch of the comments were still saying that it wasn't in the same declaration of such where it forces them to do something about it militarily. So more statements and less actual steps of stuff.
Thoughts and prayers.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of that vis-a-vis Xinjiang. That's just one of those sensitive issues that comes with a very high opportunity cost for taking action. So I suspect that Western governments in particular are going to find lots of reasons why it's not technically genocide. I think somebody was asking about that last time. Somebody was wanting to talk about Xinjiang. I think everybody's pretty familiar with it at this point, but I don't know if that person is even still listening. But for those of you who are maybe not familiar with the Uyghur issue in China. There's a province in northwestern China called Xinjiang, and the native population are what are called ethnic Uyghurs. And I think it's pronounced Uyghur, if I'm not mistaken. I could have sworn that's the correct pronunciation,
It's like
but somebody in chat was a little skeptical. So I leave open that I could be mispronouncing that, but I think I've got it right. Uh, so they're ethnic Uyghurs, and they're actually Turkish in culture, right? In terms of their language and cultural background, they have a lot more in common with the ethnic Turkish populations in Central Asia and even in Turkey itself than they do with the ethnic Han population. It's basically the Chinese population of China. Don't tell them I said that. They'll be mad at me. Technically, Chinese is the nationality. So everybody in China is technically Chinese. So the Han ethnicity is the sort of denominator for the people that sort of people outside China traditionally think of as being Chinese. But you're supposed to refer to all of them as Chinese. But anyway, yeah, ethnically they're sort of Turkish in culture, language, etc. Um, they only make up about, I want to say, less than half of the population of the province now. There's been a big effort over time to try to push ethnic Han Chinese to move to Xinjiang over the past 50 years. And, the idea there is to make it more secure. Obviously, they want more people there that have closer ties with the Chinese identity, but they also wanted to develop the province. And, the ethnic Han population was generally more educated. So it just kind of made sense in that way. So over time, intentionally and unintentionally, not or, but and, they did it for both reasons. The local native population has been watered down in terms of its proportion of the province's demographics. And for a long time, that wasn't that big a deal per se. After the communists took power in China in 1949, in general, they were pretty mellow as far as dealing with ethnic minorities. Obviously, Tibet is kind of the exception there, but that was kind of an exceptional case since they were de facto independent and they had to invade them in order to reintegrate them. And that was a whole other drama. That's a whole other case study we could talk about. But Xinjiang never broke away in the same way that Tibet or, say, Mongolia did. Lots of tangents here, but Mongolia, like the independent country that you can see on a map today, used to be a part of China. And the only reason it's not still part of China is because it basically declared independence after the Xinhai Revolution in 1911 that ended the Qing dynasty. And that was the period that created the Republic of China and was sort of the first step in many that eventually led to the People's Republic of China, modern day China. And because the Mongolian province slash state, its status was kind of ambiguous for a long time, but because it had the de facto backing of the Russian government, the Chinese could never reincorporate it into China like they could with Tibet. So Mongolia is basically the renegade province that got away, so to speak, and looks safe for the moment anyway. I don't think Chinese nationalists are so angry about it that they want to go to war over it. So their independence is secure, but that is technically an example of a breakaway province of China that successfully got away. So Xinjiang, unlike either Mongolia or Tibet, never broke away in the first place. And there's a whole, set of history that's interesting there too. There was during the warlords period of China in the 1930s, all of China was basically cut up into different fiefdoms that were run by generals, basically the eponymous warlords. And in the case of the Xinjiang territory, it was mostly run, well, the eastern portion was run by what was called the Ma clique. And I know that sounds weird, but Ma is actually a common surname for Hui Muslims in China. And if you don't know what Hui Muslims are, or Muslims rather, I always get the name wrong. Hui Muslims are basically ethnic Han Chinese who practice Islam. So that makes them different than the other Muslim populations in China, like the Uyghurs, whom are Muslims but are not ethnically Han. They're generally some other ethnic group. So the Hui are pretty common in the west of China historically because they kind of populated the eastern portion of the Silk Road that ran through northwestern China. And so a common surname is Ma, and so there was a general who fought for on behalf of the Qing Emperor, I think in like the 1700s, maybe it was the 1800s, I don't quite remember. But he did such a good job fighting for the emperor that the emperor basically gave him a degree of discretionary power within Western China that he could just use to basically govern it on the emperor's behalf. And so the successors, well, the descendants of that family became the Ma clique. They were still powerful in that region, and they actually stayed loyal to the Chinese government pretty much throughout the warlords period. Well, obviously there were multiple governments, but basically they generally hewed towards whatever government they saw as the more nationalist, the one that was trying to unify China and to kind of restore it. And as a result of all the warlords in the warlords period, the Ma clique are one of the more popular ones today in China. They have a more positive reputation because they were seen as having fought to preserve China. And one of the ways that they fought to preserve China, besides trying to side with whatever government they saw as the most nationalist, was they actually fought against separatists in Xinjiang. So there was some separatism in Xinjiang, but it was super unorganized. It was very discordant. And, at times it was actually supported by the Soviets, somewhat awkwardly, for later governments. But regardless, they were never able to overcome the Ma clique. And as a result, Xinjiang never managed to separate to the same degree that certain other provinces of China. So anyway, Xinjiang never broke away. It was always a part of China, et cetera, et cetera. And after the communists came to power in 1949, the communists generally had a pretty favorable view of ethnic minorities, and they tried to treat them relatively nicely. They weren't too overly assimilationist like some of the previous Republican governments had been in China. So for the first, maybe 20 years or so, they took a pretty light hand. And then later, they started to deal with them more heavily. I think more in like the Cultural Revolution in particular. So in that period, there was a lot of old culture, material culture, like books and scrolls and things that were targeted. And to be fair, not all of the violence was perpetrated by ethnic Han Chinese communists against the native population. There were, native-born communists amongst the ethnic Tibetan and Uyghur communities that also participated. That's the source of some internal political discord within those communities. But in general, the government took a harder line, basically, in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. And it wasn't until sort of the 1980s with the opening period under Deng Xiaoping that they started to go easier. That was under the more conservative government of, what's his name? Hu Yaobang, I think his name, or Hu Yaobang. I'm always getting the A sound wrong in these names. But hopefully you know who I'm talking about here. But during the 1980s, basically, they allowed them more discretion to kind of do their own thing, to govern themselves, practice their culture, etc. And that kind of continued a little bit into the 90s. And then maybe also some of the aughts, I want to say. But I think in general, there was a conservative turn after Tiananmen Square, obviously. So there was some of the opening, well, they started to kind of reverse the opening in the 90s after Tiananmen Square. But they didn't completely close it up like they have more recently. What happened more recently is that, after 2010 roughly, for the most part, there were more terrorist attacks by either by Islamists or separatist Uyghurs or whomever. We don't entirely know. The Chinese government isn't entirely upfront about exactly what happened. But there were terrorist attacks. We do know that much. And so Uyghurs were blamed for that. And there had been some, unrest and terrorist activity in the 90s, but it was relatively mild. And the government was able to deal with it pretty handily. The government blamed it on what they called the East Turkestan movement or some such. It was sort of a throwback to an older manifestation of East Turkestan independence. But that's the organization they blame to this day for, unrest in Xinjiang. So after the terrorist attacks started to crop up, there was a lot of discontent within the Chinese government because they kind of felt like the situation was getting out of control. And so what they decided to do was to crack down. And they actually decided to do it pretty early on. It may have been as early as like 2012 or so. So it wasn't exactly like it wasn't something that happened in the past few years, since it's gained more public prominence. They actually started doing it like 10 years ago. But it was relatively small scale at the start, and it kind of escalated over time, such that people outside Xinjiang didn't really notice it much until maybe like 2015 or so, 2015, 2016, something around there. At least that's when I remember kind of reading more about it. And what the Chinese government decided to do about the problem was basically some old school hardcore assimilationist policy, which is that they started to kind of round up pretty much anybody and everybody they suspected of being conservative Uyghurs, conservative in the cultural sense, and they put them in what they described as vocational camps. That was their preferred euphemism, and supposedly the nominal logic was that they were going to teach them Chinese because Chinese language, well, not Chinese per se, but Mandarin. Mandarin language proficiency amongst the ethnic Uyghurs was not great. It wasn't very good. And so one of the things they wanted to do was to try to improve the proficiency of the Mandarin spoken by the native population. And also they wanted to teach them skills, allegedly. Again, that's why they called them vocational camps. They were allegedly trying to teach them work skills so that they could better integrate into the Chinese economy. So technically, all of this makes sense. I mean, if you have a population that's restive, that's ethnically distinct, and doesn't have good educational opportunities, and doesn't, by extension, have very good economic opportunities, it kind of makes sense to try to improve education, work skills, etc. But the trouble is that the broad suspicion at this point is that the government is not just trying to improve their circumstances by improving, language skills and educational skills and whatnot. It's broadly suspected that it's to make them Chinese specifically. Because they're not just teaching them new skills, they're also trying to distance them from their traditional culture. They already had a rule in place that you could not practice Islam in a mosque unless you were over, I think, 18 or maybe 21, something like that. So they did that to try to keep the kids away from, the mosque, and in order to try to kind of water down.
Wait, they couldn't go to a mosque until they were 18 or 21?
Yeah, I believe that's what the rule was. So you basically had to be an adult before you could go to actually practice Islam in that manner. So if you were practicing Muslim as a child, then it would have had to have been because your parents taught you, basically.
Dude, I just straight up imagined, what if that happened in Texas where they said you have to be 18 to 21 to go to church? I can already hear the screaming in my mind.
Well, I mean, it would probably be met with laughter because that's, about as unlikely a scenario as I could think of for the state of Texas. You would need some kind of occupation government to even have a state government that would want to do that in the first place. But yes, you're correct. If anybody tried to do that,
well, I was just saying that my freedom to practice religion is such like an ingrained part of being an American that I don't usually think of like, what if they didn't allow people to go to church? I think the closest thing to that they've complained about is during the pandemic. They say you should quarantine or whatever, and they say, no, I want to go to church. That's basically the closest it gets, but it's not about the religious practice there. It's more about like health stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty rough restriction to place upon people.
Oh yeah. And it's only gotten more severe since then. I mean, some of the other restrictions have involved banning beards on men, since one of the I don't know that it's in the Quran, but like in general, you're supposed to kind of grow out your beard. Mm-hmm. That's either a cultural thing associated with Islam or it's an Islamic tenet. I don't know enough about Uyghur culture and Islam as a religion to know which it is. But a lot of conservative Uyghurs have historically grown out their beards. And the Chinese government has basically banned that. You're not supposed to do that. Some of the more egregious examples are some of the harder to confirm. So one of the things that we know that the Chinese government has done is send party, well, not apparatchiks, what do I want? Cadres. And I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing cadre. I've been pronouncing it cadre my whole life, but then I found out recently that's not the correct pronunciation. So I think it's cadre. So I'm going to go with that for the moment. So the party has been sending party cadres to go and visit people in their homes in order to, talk with them nominally in order to see how much they've integrated and how well they're doing and to keep track of them and whatnot. But allegedly, they're also there to kind of look for signs of religiosity, to kind of look for signs that they're practicing traditional culture and that they might be dissenters of some kind. So basically spying on them, in other words. So we know they've been doing that much. But allegedly, there's also been a push to try to get those same cadres to live with those people over an extended period of time, weeks or months or whatever. And I don't know that I've seen confirmation of that, but that accusation has definitely made the rounds. I'm a little cautious about committing to some of the accusations that have been made, because, certainly the Chinese government is authoritarian. It doesn't care about human rights. So obviously they can just kind of do whatever the hell they want. So, I'm not trying to defend them here. But when it comes to wild-assed accusations against authoritarian governments, they're a dime a dozen. It's not hard to find dissenting groups and whatnot who will go out of their way to make wild accusations of one sort or another. Sometimes with evidence, oftentimes without. So I generally try to wait for things that are within the realm of reason or for which there's a fair amount of confirmed evidence before I commit to it. So the idea that there are cadres who are staying with families or staying with families where the men have been forced to go to the camps and, are being raped basically by ethnic Han Chinese or are being forced to marry ethnic Han Chinese, I haven't seen as much confirmation of things like that. But those accusations have been made, and I could be wrong, and those could be substantive. It's just kind of hard to confirm right now. But that's all just sort of part of the same program of assimilation that the Chinese government is practicing right now. So in addition to having camps, which are nominally dedicated to education and indoctrination and language skills, they're also putting pressure on families outside of the camps in order to assimilate by exposing them to some degree to ethnic Han Chinese party members. And at the very least, they're being visited and spied on. It's possible, possible, it's been alleged that they're being forced into marriage with ethnic Han, and that they're being forced to allow ethnic Han cadres to live in their family home with them.
So I'm kind of seeing the picture here of, it's, in my opinion, very clear that if these things are true, their freedoms are being very heavily infringed upon in a variety of categories.
That's putting it mildly.
Yes.
Yeah.
But then whether that crosses the boundary point of what is genocide, it's certainly aggressively trying to shift their culture of hey guys, you're not really very good at being Chinese. Here, we're going to show you how to be Chinese. But they don't want to be Chinese, I would guess, if you asked just the people who are there. A lot of people like keeping the traditions of the previous generation because that's what makes the local people unique and have a history kind of a thing.
Yeah, most likely that's the case. But, unfortunately for them, they're caught up in the machinery of a one-party state.
Yeah.
One that is very large and very intrusive, and that is extremely risk averse. Sometimes we think of risk aversion as meaning that you're more shy and reserved and that you don't mess with people. But another manifestation of risk aversion is that you are basically the opposite, that you're very intrusive and that you try to interject yourself wherever possible so that you can always keep an eye on people to make sure they're not plotting against you. Mm-hmm. And so that's how risk aversion tends to manifest in one-party states like China's. They had a problem with terrorism. How substantive it was is unclear, but there was a problem with terrorism, and there was a problem with that terrorism partly being fed by dissatisfaction and poverty amongst the ethnic Uyghur population in Xinjiang. Mm-hmm. So the risk-averse solution here, and the one that's in keeping with the authoritarian political culture of the Communist Party of China, was to basically create a mass mobilization effort in Xinjiang, where they just inundate the province with military personnel, intelligence agents, and party cadres, in order to basically track everybody's every move and to try to observe everybody to the nth degree in order to gauge just not dissentive, uh, to gauge how in opposition to the party they were. Basically, they wanted to try to watch everybody and see if they were suspects. And if they were, then you go to the camps, and if they're not, then you just keep them under continuous surveillance. I mean, the stuff I've described thus far is not even everything they've been doing. Like another thing they've done is that they've flooded Xinjiang with security personnel, such that you can see not just police, but like actual army infantry, often deployed just all over the place, especially in major cities. And they also have checkpoints virtually everywhere, such that they track your almost your every movement. And you're also required to install an app on your phone, which basically is just a spy app, and you can't take it off. And if you try, that's suspicious. You can guess, what happens to you then. So they just try to track all of your calls, record all of your calls, etc. And so there's not really a lot of space for, individual expression right now. They've got it locked down thoroughly at this point. Yeah, even the people who have got out get harassed. Like there are some ethnic Uyghurs who travel abroad, generally before the crackdown happened. And a lot of them just won't go back because they're afraid. And what happens is that they'll get these phone calls from their relatives, and the relatives will basically try to tell them to come home. They'll say, hey, you've been gone too long. You should come back. I think it's what would be best for you. But the general impression amongst the people who receive those calls is that their family members are being coerced, which they can kind of tell, based off of, the tone of the language, the body language, etc. They kind of infer that these phone calls are not like voluntary. And sometimes they'll actually get a call from authorities themselves. They'll just full on get a call from like an intelligence agent or a police officer from China, and they'll just tell them, hey, you need to come back. If they say, well, I don't really want to, then they'll basically try to threaten them. They'll say, well, maybe something happens to somebody we happen to have your father in the police station right now. And I've seen at least one video where they did this. The police officer actually just kind of turned around and pointed the camera at this guy's dad in the police station with him. And they never really say anything explicit, like, we're definitely going to arrest him or torture him or whatever. But the threat is always heavily implied that something is going to happen if you don't comply. So those phone calls are also apparently pretty common amongst the diaspora community. So that's another way that they try to pressure people into either coming back to China or into at least behaving themselves overseas. Behaving themselves meaning that they don't criticize the Chinese government or the things the Chinese government has been doing in Xinjiang. So yes, more than a few rights are being infringed upon.
Mm.
And I don't think their chances are that good. To be blunt. We've already seen what happened to Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is a territory that had much more in terms of connections to the West. That was much more visible crackdown. And it was also, a lighter one, to be fair, but still, that was something that the West could see very clearly, and there just wasn't a whole lot they could do about it. With Xinjiang, the Chinese government is even more committed to the crackdown. They see it as in their interest. And again, the party is very risk averse, and this is like a risk averse solution to a perceived problem. Like if you're having a problem with the rest of population, just lock it down, just thoroughly. And that's pretty much what they've done. And I don't think they're going to be very receptive to any appeals by the West to try to take it easy, any more than they've been by Western appeals to take it easy on Hong Kong or to open up their markets to trade or any of the other things that have been problems as far as China's relations with Western governments. For them, it's a sovereignty issue. It's their territory, and they think they should be allowed to do what they want there. And they've got a lot of leverage to work with. Very few governments overseas have really been willing to go to bat for Xinjiang. There have been some laws that have been implemented. I don't want to like fully undermine what has been done. Like the United States has a bill that's either about to be passed or has already been passed, but basically it forbids Western, well, not Western, but American companies from using any companies in their supply chain that source goods from Xinjiang. And that law is written rather ambiguously, such that firms will probably just stop trading with firms in Xinjiang completely in order to make sure that they're in compliance.
Hmm.
So there is some effort at what amounts to economic deterrence here on the part of the United States as well as countries in Europe. But like we were talking about before with Russia, if there's something that a foreign government really, really wants to do that they see as in their core interest, sanctions are probably not going to be enough. And that's likely to be the case with China. But I don't think anybody wants to like invade China seriously. That's not a serious prospect. The country has nuclear weapons in any case. But even if they didn't, that would be really hard.
Mm-hmm.
So realistically speaking, diplomacy and sanctions are about the only real options here. And that's about it. So in all likelihood, I suspect that one of two things will happen in Xinjiang. Either the Chinese government is just going to keep doing what they're doing until the population is mostly assimilated. And it's not as though there's not historical precedent for operations like this succeeding. I mean, the United States and Native Americans are a case in point. France and Germany and other countries in Europe have had programs where they tried to homogenize populations. France used to have a lot of diversity in terms of local languages and maybe not ethnicities per se, but certainly local identities, like Occitane on the southern coast of France, on the Mediterranean, Brittany in the northwest, etc. And those identities haven't been completely destroyed, but they have been homogenized into being pretty marginal to people's identities. Germany still has relatively strong provincial identities, Bavaria in particular. But even there, those have been watered down over time, such that, the standard German dialect, for example, is now spoken almost universally, where that wasn't necessarily true, I think maybe 50, 60 years ago. Italy has much stronger regional identities, but it's also made a lot of headway in that regard. So it's not as though other countries haven't done this kind of thing. But it's kind of fallen out of favor since we've entered sort of the postmodern period of individual rights and indigenous rights and whatnot. That kind of perspective has become much more common in the developed world in particular. So, seeing what China is doing in Xinjiang for somebody living in the West is like reading something out of a history book. Like things like that aren't supposed to happen anymore. But they do, obviously. And probably there will be more examples in other parts of the world too, because other parts of the world are starting to modernize just like Europe did 100, 200 years ago, and they're probably going to face similar nationalist demands for homogenization. And that's no doubt going to create a lot of political discontent in foreign relations between the developed world and the developing world. That's kind of more of a long-term trend to keep an eye on. But as far as Xinjiang, yeah, either the Chinese government is going to keep doing what they're doing until the program is successful and the population has largely what you might call sinified or sinified. I guess I'm not sure how to pronounce that either. But basically assimilated. Or alternatively, the government will have another change in heart like it had, in previous eras over the past 50 years and will relax the restrictions, either marginally or substantively, depending on what kind of changes in power happen. Given that Xi Jinping is probably in power for life and looks set to live, a decent amount of time, I don't think he's going to die anytime soon. And given that he himself is a pretty conservative communist and authoritarian, most likely I expect there's not going to be a change in policy in the short to medium term. So I expect then the more likely outcome is that they just keep the policy in place over the long term.
Do they not have
And
term limits?
They actually did.
Oh.
And they got rid of them a few years ago. Yeah, they had I mean, there's no rule of law in China, so it's not like there's ever any real rules per se, other than the rules of whoever is the most powerful faction at a given time. But during the reform period in the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping and some of the other leadership kind of got together and reached a consensus that the period of mass mobilization during the Cultural Revolution was really, really fucking bad, to put it mildly. Everybody hated that, and everybody kind of agreed that they should never do that again. So, in order to try to preclude that, what they did is, among other things, they reached an agreement in which there would be a transition of power every 10 years. So rather than every transition of power being a, life or death struggle for a lifetime appointment to lead China, they agreed that whoever was paramount leader would only lead for 10 years and then would step down, and then somebody else would step in. And it's kind of hard to pinpoint factions exactly in China, such that you can say there's like two factions or four factions that trade power between one another. It really is more just patronage networks and individual personal networks, more so than factions per se, like we would think of them in the West. But in general, there was kind of a back and forth between what you might call the princes, sort of people that had a stronger family background in the communist revolution in the 1940s and 50s, and then people who had kind of come up in the Communist Youth League. Again, these networks overlap, so it's not as though it's like one or the other, but kind of in general, you can see rough contours where personal networks were formed by either family connections or by professional connections growing up in communist institutions. So that kind of worked for a while up until Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. And I don't think he messed with it at first, but a couple years into his rule, like I want to say 2016, maybe something around there, he and his people got together and just said, we're not going to do this anymore. They changed the Constitution, in so much as that even matters, but they legally changed the Constitution to get rid of term limits. But more to the point, they've basically explicitly signaled that they're not going to respect that 10-year transition of power anymore that was formed in the 1980s. And so, that's great if you're Xi Jinping. That's removes a lot of uncertainty for you as to what's going to happen to you and your network after the end of that 10-year period. But for everybody else, it creates a lot of uncertainty. And actually, for the stability of Chinese politics as a whole, it creates a lot of uncertainty. Because right now, it's winner take all. And that creates a lot of temptation for ambitious people to make power plays. Because as much risk is involved, if you make a power play and you fail, you're probably going to be killed or exiled or, put in prison or what have you. That's high risk, but there's high reward. If you win, then you're emperor of China basically for life. And so that's going to create some problems down the road. I suspect for now, Xi Jinping's network is probably strong enough and resilient enough for him not to worry about it too much. But he's not going to live forever. Something's going to happen sooner or later. And that transition of power may not be as stable as they would like. And that's going to create problems when it happens. But we'll see where that goes. It actually kind of reminds me of Mikhail Gorbachev. I've been reading a little more about him in some of the old Russia books that I dug up out of storage recently. One of the things that I read about him that kind of surprised me is that he was actually super conservative in terms of, being a communist. He was a very doctrinaire communist. And his desire to liberalize the economy and politics of the Soviet Union was not born out of any liberalism on his part. He was strictly trying to make marginal improvements to the system that was obviously failing. And he was explicitly trying to save it and avoid like full-on liberalization while doing so. And, for those of you who are not history mavens, it didn't work. The Soviet Union did not do too well in the late 1980s, early 90s. And, whether or not there's really anything that could have been done to save the Soviet Union at that point is debatable, but Gorbachev's approach obviously did not work. But the parallel there is that Xi Jinping also seems to be a fairly conservative communist in a lot of ways. I suspect he's more flexible than Gorbachev. He seems, that is to say, Xi Jinping seems more willing to entertain opposition ideas. I've seen some evidence, for example, of economic liberal policies that have been implemented. But the overall dent of his policies over the past 10 years, especially the past 5 years, seems to be very much focused on empowering and entrenching the largest institutions in China, specifically the legitimacy of the Communist Party itself, the military, and state-owned enterprises. Those institutions in particular seem to be the focus. And alternative sources of power have largely been either targeted uh, in order to marginalize them or have been outright eliminated, as was the case for a lot of political rivals in competing patronage networks. So, on the one hand, this could be the effort needed to kind of make changes that modernize the country and deal with some outstanding problems. But like Gorbachev, it might be implemented in a way that creates more problems that unravel in an unpredictable way that totally undermines the party's governance. It remains to be seen, which way it'll go. Economically speaking, China is on much stronger footing than the Soviet Union ever was. So in that sense, they're actually doing pretty good. So I suspect if they have problems, it's going to be more political problems. And, because it's an opaque political system, we can't really see what's going on there. So, whatever happens is probably going to happen without us seeing it coming. It'll probably just pop out unexpectedly and we'll just hear about it on the news one day and be like, oh, I guess that's a thing that's been brewing for a while.
You were saying that China doesn't have rule of law. What is the thing they have called? A rule of what?
I guess the alternative would be rule of man, which is generally the alternative. It's just basically the rule of whoever is in power.
And it would be what that person decides should be the outcome, rather than
Yeah.
rule of law is ruling based on precedent of other law people before you.
Yeah, it's having a written legal code and then implementing it and enforcing it impartially.
Mm-hmm.
So even if the law is written such that it's inconvenient to you personally as the leader of your country, you still enforce it out of respect for the rule of law.
Mm-hmm.
And the rule of law is very much well, it's an old concept. It goes back, thousands of years or whatever, but it's really, in its present form, a liberal idea that came out of the West. An Enlightenment liberal idea, that is to say. And the idea was to have, impartial rules that could not be used capriciously by a ruler who could, write his own rules basically as he went. And that could also benefit people by creating a market in which contracts could be enforced predictably and reliably, such that people were more confident in their ability to sign contracts that would be enforced and thereby engage in relatively more economic activity and take on relatively more economic risk than they would otherwise, with corresponding economic benefits. So there's a legal, political, and economic argument here in favor of liberalism, and that's kind of rooted in Enlightenment ideals about, humanism and trying to curtail tyrants and tyranny and etc. It's very much an outgrowth of that. So rule of law is pretty hard to get because it requires, again, at least some degree of impartial enforcement. But a lot of countries just don't even try. Like communist countries like the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China have the trappings of rule of law. Like they have a judicial system, they have courts, they have lawyers, they have a constitution, etc. Well, I guess in the Soviet case, they had all of these things. That's obviously not around anymore. But they have all of the institutional framework in place to have rule of law, but they don't actually have rule of law because politics is paramount. Like the communist parties of these respective countries made it very clear to judges and lawyers and whatnot that the party line was more important than what the law said. So how the law was enforced, interpreted, argued, etc., was always highly variable, depending on whatever the party line was at a given time.
Mm-hmm.
So there was no such thing, for example, of a communist party ruled government ever having to make any kind of sacrifice because of a legal loophole or because of a contradiction in the law. Because whenever stuff like that would happen, the party would just tell the judge to rule in such and such way, because to do otherwise would be inconvenient for national security reasons, economic reasons, legitimacy reasons, like whatever kind of reason. Like it didn't really matter. There was always an excuse, basically. And in China, it's especially bad because China, unfortunately, has a lot of corruption kind of embedded in the political culture. And to be fair, that's not a communist thing. That's just kind of an archaic thing. Partly it's something you can see in every developing country. There's just pretty much always problems with trying to create a professional bureaucracy that is not susceptible to bribery. But also, just looking at China's political culture historically, bribery and corruption has just kind of always been a common theme. It hasn't always been cripplingly bad. There have been periods of Chinese history when China was more well governed than in other parts, but a certain amount of corruption and self-indulgence on the part of officials has always kind of been part of the Chinese political scenery, so to speak. And so in China's case, because they had such an advanced civilization and because those norms were so deeply embedded historically, it's particularly difficult to unwind them, after the fact, now that China in the past 100 years has tried to kind of modernize itself in the Western mold. So in addition to having rule of man, they also have this problem with endemic bribery and corruption and self-interest within the apparatus of state. So long as, even in cases then where there's not like an explicit problem that makes the party want to intervene in order to weigh the outcome of the court case, even in those cases, you still have a problem with one party or the other trying to bribe the judge or to intimidate the judge using political connections or what have you. So the whole thing is just kind of very messy, basically. To be fair, again, to China, they have been making strides to kind of clean up their institutions such that they're relatively more modern, more sleekly designed, more rational, etc. But it's yeoman's work. It's just like a big task, given the size of China's bureaucracy, given the sheer amount of opportunities for corruption, and the benefit to doing so. I mean, given how rich China is, there's a lot of money you can make by being corrupt, especially if you have a really powerful position. So the temptation is great, and it takes correspondingly great efforts on the part of would-be reformers to deal with it. But even those efforts are generally sabotaged because generally the only reason the government tries to reform anything at all anyway is to undermine rivals so that they can go and be corrupt unencumbered.
Look, get out of the way. You're over here being corrupt. I'm trying to be corrupt, and I can't be corrupt when you're being corrupt.
Yeah, competition between rival patronage networks is a real part of every authoritarian government. Even ones that are seemingly so hierarchical and top-down as, say, North Korea, even they have factional battles, turf wars, etc. So, it doesn't really matter how it closed the system. There's always people disagreeing and competing for territory, so to speak. In this case, bureaucratic territory rather than physical territory, but it happens in a very similar way. And ideally, you have some kind of institution in place to govern that competition. In the case of liberal democracies, we have rule of law, we have electoral systems, etc., but by which we channel that kind of competition. But in an authoritarian one-party state, oftentimes all you really have are handshake agreements, like the one that was basically made in the 1980s in China. But obviously that's broken down, as handshake agreements frequently do. And so now they're kind of back to square one in a lot of ways. So it remains to be seen if Xi Jinping can kind of navigate this period where he's created political uncertainty and in exchange gotten a lot of political power. Maybe he's able to implement the reforms China needs, or maybe he's basically wound the spring that's going to unwind all of China's politics and progress over the past 30 years. It could go either way. So that's something China watchers are eagerly keeping an eye on. But that's a bit of a tangent. We were talking about Xinjiang rather.
Yeah.
Or is it Xinjiang? I hope we have somebody who speaks Mandarin who can help me with some of this stuff.
People were taking issue with the pronunciation of, I think a lot of Americans would say the Quran. When I've seen documentaries and stuff, they say something like Quran, which is, I guess, I'm probably still saying it wrong. We're trying, fam.
I'll look it up.
We trying.
Google, well, actually, Google will help us. Quran, or Quran, or let's see, pronounce.
Quran. Quran? Crown?
Quran. Quran. There we go.
Quran.
Yeah, Quran. So you had it, Neuro. At least that's what Google says. Maybe that's actually, yeah, it says it right here. This is the American pronunciation. So this is kind of like the Sikhs and Sikhs thing we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
They're supposed to be called Sikhs, but in America they're called Sikhs.
Mm-hmm.
because the religious organization that represents Sikhs in America said that they didn't like that it sounded like the word Sikh. So apparently, America has been carved out as an exception for the pronunciation of the word. So we get to call them Sikhs. The rest of you have to call them Sikhs. So in this case, the American pronunciation is Quran. Quran. Okay. I'll try to remember that. But yeah, hopefully that's a satisfying review of the Xinjiang issue for that one guy basically the last time we talked to wanted me to talk about it. I would point out here, just as an epilogue, to the whole Xinjiang discussion here, that even if China democratized, they would probably be still treating the Uyghurs much the same as they are now. Because from the people I've talked to and from what I've read, the Uyghur population in China is not very popular. They kind of have a negative reputation, not just because of the terrorist incidents that happened, but also because a lot of people are upset about affirmative action. There's a effort on the part of there was basically an effort on the part of the Chinese government to try to ensure that ethnic minorities had favored job placement within the Chinese workforce. And so as a result, ethnic minorities like the Uyghurs and Tibetans and other such minorities were often preferred as hires in various jobs. And that's apparently been the source of no small amount of contention on the part of the ethnic Han population. So terrorism and affirmative action have apparently undermined that group's popularity amongst the ethnic Han population, such that Chinese nationalists in a prospective democratic China would probably be demanding very similar assimilationist policies, if not even more fervent, assimilationist policies, given how nationalists are. Oh, let's see. How are we doing on time? I remember you wanted to kind of truncate it this time.
Yeah. We'll say like 10, 15 minutes.
10, 15? Okay. We're probably going to have some... We had some leftover questions, so we probably won't get to them. So I apologize again to those people. We'll probably have to get to them next time. Trying to see if there's any we can kind of get to that we
Someone
have
said there
time
was
for.
something that happened in Abu Dhabi a couple hours ago, and they were asking if you'd heard of that.
Ethiopia?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I hadn't heard anything. Let's see what's up. I guess I could update you on Ethiopia. There's been some developments there. I don't see anything on BBC. Oh, 2 killed
Abu
at
Dhabi?
Ethiopia religious festival. I guess that could be it.
UAE. That's what they're saying.
Oh, the UAE.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, there was a Are you familiar with the Houthis?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they attacked a I don't know, some commercial district or something in the United Arab Emirates using a drone. So that was kind of reminiscent of the drone attack that the Houthis, or possibly the Iranians, perpetrated against the oil refinery in Saudi Arabia back in, 2019 or early 2020 or whenever that was. So that was kind of seen as an escalation. It's not that much of a surprise at this point. I mean, the Houthis have also been using drones to attack shipping and, some other targets of opportunity. So they've been doing it enough that it's not that much of a surprise at this point. And as I understand it, from what I read, the Saudis have already retaliated to the Houthi strike on the UAE by attacking some targets in and around Sana'a. Is that what it was? Yeah, I believe it was in and around the capital, Sana'a, which the Houthis still hold. think they blew up like a prison or something, and people were bitching them out for targeting a civilian target. But yeah, I wouldn't read too much into it. It's not as though the UAE isn't deeply involved in the Yemen conflict. So they were actually more involved before, but they drew down their troops in order to focus on supporting their proxies from afar rather than being directly involved themselves. So their involvement has been more distant since then. So, but I don't think this recent attack is going to change their approach. They're probably pretty content to just use their proxies on the ground as their avatars in the conflict. Ground troops are expensive. But yeah, basically, I don't think the drone strike really changes the calculus for the conflict at all, at least as I understand it. Yeah, I'm still not. Well, to kind of update you briefly on Ethiopia, last time when we talked about this, the rebel troops were approaching the capital. Since then, they've actually withdrawn almost completely to Tigray province. And it's not entirely clear why. I did note that after they started withdrawing, that the Ethiopian government released a bunch of prisoners that belonged to the TPLF. So it could be that there was a quid pro quo where the rebels agreed to back off in exchange for the release of certain leaders who the Ethiopian government had arrested. But regardless, the Ethiopian government has since taken back the territory that they'd lost to the TPLF. And since then, they've basically just been stuck in deadlock. I don't think there's been much change since then. But the immediate threat to the capital is over, and there's been more negotiations. There's also been a pretty steady drumbeat of Ethiopian airstrikes on Tigray territory, so it's not as though there's not still violence happening, but it seems that TPLF ambitions to expand out of Tigray province or to threaten the capital in some way are now over, and they have since been contained to their native province. Maybe they'll come back out if the negotiations don't go anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if they'll have the manpower or the money to do so. The de facto embargo of their territory is probably doing damage by this point. I'm sure there's smuggling going on, but they need a lot of fertilizer and other equipment and whatnot to like fully exploit their land and produce enough food for everybody. And without that, they're probably getting subpar harvests.
Mm-hmm.
And at this juncture, there's going to be a real problem with hunger. I mean, there's already food shortages. International humanitarian organizations have been very clear about that, but it's only going to get worse from here. So I kind of suspect that they kind of reached a point where they could have beaten the Ethiopian army and taken the capital, but just did not, kind of like what we talked about last time, basically. They just didn't have the logistical capacity to manage the capital,
Mm-hmm.
given that they still would have been cut off from international trade and resources and whatnot. So it may be that given the limitations of their ability to project power outside of Tigray province, a deal where they get certain people released from prison was maybe the best they could do. I would also point out that there may have been secret provisions reached between the two sides. So there may have been like a provision where the Ethiopian government allows a certain amount of food aid to get in or otherwise relaxes their embargo. Embargo is not the word, blockade. There we go. That's the word I want. Maybe the Ethiopian government agreed to relax somewhat their blockade of Tigray province such that they could get some more food in. But I don't know. That stuff is probably not going to become public for like another couple of years. You probably won't even hear about it until some insider writes a book about it or some such. But yeah, situation has since stabilized, so kind of good news in that sense. And I guess before we hop off here, I think I got an email. Well, we got a YouTube comment and an email from Dagnip,
Mm-hmm.
one of our Argentine listeners, and he suggested that, well, he said that he'd sent me an email and that it might be in the spam folder, and he was right. It was in my spam folder. So I apologize for not responding to that email. I did not know, I did not check my spam folder, and so I had not realized it was there. So I've since then discovered the email in question, and I'm going to read through it and try to learn more about the espionage case, so-called, that he brought up in chat a couple weeks ago. So thank you for contributing in chat and in the YouTube comments there, Dagnep. I appreciate the effort, and I'm glad I was able to find that email from you. Yeah, I would be certainly interested in hearing more about the Peronist perspective on Argentine politics, because that's not a perspective. I mean, I don't have much perspective on Argentine politics in general. So if you ever want to email more or even do an interview sometime, I'd certainly be interested.
Nice.
Did we have any unusual flags this time?
Can take a look.
Got one from Serbia. That's new.
Nice.
Oh, Thailand. That's pretty cool. Thailand's been a pretty happening place. I haven't talked about it much, but there's been a lot of protests and anti-government activity trying to end the monarchy there. That never really fully stopped, and the government's been getting increasingly autocratic as far as how they've dealt with protesters and whatnot. They've been really throwing around the lèse majesty laws lately.
What is a lèse majesty law?
That's basically a law that makes it a crime to criticize or insult the king.
Oh.
Yeah. And there's a lot to insult about the current king of Thailand. You know?
Yeah, this is the degen one that they have now, right?
The what?
The degen one where he's kind of jacking around and not really taking it seriously?
I don't know if he's not taking it seriously, but he definitely was not taking it seriously before he became king. You know, when he was just the prince, he spent almost his entire life in Europe. And there's, you know, my favorite photo of him is the one in the crop top with his trashy girlfriend getting onto a plane. It's just weirdly homely how he looked back then. He's since cleaned up, you know, obviously he's king now, so he has to dress like a general and whatnot. But yeah, he looked a bit like a redneck in some of those older photographs.
Well, he's probably got people to address him and make sure he looks good now.
Yep. I imagine probably the army, at least. The army wants to kind of make him out to be like, you know, a legitimate, fully realized king with all of the respect that's supposed to entail. But the public isn't buying it. You know, they liked the old king, but this current king, no. He's just a little too, he just seems too obviously to be a tool of the army to retain power over Thai politics, and people aren't on board with that. I think the interesting thing I read recently about Thailand was that, I mean, I think you remember us talking about this back in the day, how there were yellow shirts versus red shirts in Thai politics. So what I've read recently is that over the past, couple years, the divide between the yellow shirts and the red shirts has basically disappeared. Like, everybody is sufficiently upset at the government now and the lack of democracy that that divide is gone, and that everybody is pretty on board with trying to reform the constitution.
Do they have orange shirts?
Sorry, what?
Do they have orange shirts?
I'm afraid not. At least not that I'm aware of.
They could make a ton of money. I mean, it's between the two. If they can agree, then t-shirt sales.
I'm not sure what kind of symbolism they're using. I think the one that I remember was the salute from the Hunger Games. That seems to be one of the main symbols that the protesters have been using the past few years. But somebody from Thailand, if we have one, could probably would know better than me on that count. This is a little bit of a joke. This is a little bit of a tangent, but I do remember recently reading about some protesters who kind of made fun of the king by wearing crop tops in public during a protest, which I thought was hilarious.
Oh, the Hunger Games salute is 3 fingers. I didn't know what it was, so I looked it up.
Oh, yeah. Oh, wow. We've got somebody from Liechtenstein. Now, this isn't one of you using a proxy to hoax me, is it? Somebody was mentioning that last time. Well, if that is somebody from actual Liechtenstein, hello. I guess I know exactly where you are since it's such a tiny country. It's not like there's a lot of different cities you could be in. Cool. And it's always fun looking at the map, looking at the flags here.
Chat,
Well,
if
thank
you
you
have
for
any input or stories from the country that you're in, feel free to share in the YouTube comments. It's probably the best place for that after the show. You can read those, and if you got something interesting going on, local news is really cool to hear about too. I think a lot of people, for wherever they live, they're actually kind of sick of their own local news because it's looped on a 24-hour news cycle and you hear the same stuff all the time. So hearing about other places is one of the main things we try to bring to world discussion. Is not to be too focused on U.S. politics and all that, but to hear from everyone else around the world. Thank you, Agent Smith, for coming on and for your time. Thank you, Moss, for handling some questions for us. And thanks, chat, for providing conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Always a privilege, and thank everybody in chat for participating and contributing to our little thing here that we've got.
Hell yeah. There's a big playlist of all these on YouTube, which I just linked in the chat if people are curious about that. And cool. Well, we'll see you on the next one, Mr. Agent Smith. You take care of yourself, okay?
Yep. See you next time. You take care of yourself, too. Don't push yourself too hard.
Oh, I won't. I'm going to end an hour early today.
There you go. All right. Sleep well, buddy.
Yep.
I'll talk to you
see you
next
on the
week.
next one. GG. Nice. And that's a wrap.